Every time you check your bank balance, swipe a credit card, or transfer money with a single click, you are using a system that was perfected 600 years ago. It wasn't invented by a king, an emperor, or a government. It was forged by a family of wool merchants from Florence. A family that used a secret accounting trick to become the masters of Europe to finance the Renaissance. And to build the blueprint for the entire global financial system we live in today, history remembers the Medici family for the art they funded. For Michelangelo's David and Brunelleschi's Dome, they are remembered as the godfathers of the Renaissance, enlightened patrons who lifted Europe out of the Dark Ages. But that's the story they paid for. That's the most successful act of reputation laundering in human history. The real story is darker. It's about how a simple innovation in a dusty ledger became a secret weapon. A weapon that allowed one family to control popes, topple governments, and create a financial empire so powerful it would make the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers look like apprentices. This isn't a story about art, it's a story about power. And it begins with the realization that the most powerful force in the world isn't an army or a crown, it's control over the ledger. To understand how the Medici took over, you first need to understand the world they were born into. 14th century Europe was a financial nightmare. Kings were the worst customers you could possibly have. They would borrow enormous sums of money to fund their wars, and then, when the bills came due, they would simply declare bankruptcy, or worse, have their bankers arrested and executed. In the 1340s, the two biggest banks in Florence, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, learned this the hard way. They had lent a fortune to King Edward III of England to finance his wars with France. When Edward defaulted, both banks collapsed in a catastrophic chain reaction. Depositors were ruined. Trade froze. The crash plunged Florence into chaos. The lesson was brutal. In this world, trust was a fool's game. Banking was a high-stakes gamble with no rules and no protection. Financial records were a mess of single-entry notes, making it almost impossible for a banker to see the full picture of his business. He might know who owed him money in Florence, but tracking debts and credits across multiple cities and currencies was a recipe for disaster. Banks were flying blind and they were crashing constantly. This was the world Giovanni di Medici surveyed. He wasn't a nobleman. He was from a family of merchants, dealing in wool and cloth. He was cautious, quiet, and almost invisible in the loud world of Florentine politics. But Giovanni understood something that the flamboyant bankers of his day did not. The chaos wasn't a problem to be avoided. It was an opportunity to be exploited. And he had a secret weapon that would allow him to do it. The weapon wasn't a sword or a poison. It was a book, a ledger. But it was organized using a revolutionary system, one that had been floating around merchant circles, but had never been weaponized on a grand scale. Today, we call it double-entry bookkeeping. It sounds boring. It sounds like something for accountants. But in the 15th century, it was a tool of almost supernatural power. Here's how it worked, and why it was so deadly. For every transaction, two entries were made in the ledger. A debit in one account, and a corresponding credit in another. If you loaned a merchant 100 florins, you would debit his account for 100, and credit your cash account for 100. The result was a system in perfect, beautiful balance. At any moment, the sum of all debits had to equal the sum of all credits. If they didn't, you knew instantly that a mistake had been made. It was a self-correcting machine for tracking money. For the first time, a banker could see his entire financial universe on a single set of pages. He could see his assets and his liabilities, his profits and his losses, all laid out with crystal clarity. While his rivals were drowning in a sea of disorganized notes, Giovanni de' Medici had a real-time dashboard of his entire operation. He could spot risks before they became catastrophes. He could see which clients were profitable and which were a drain. Information is power, and the Medici ledger gave him perfect information. But that was only half of the weapon. Giovanni's second innovation was even more brilliant. He looked at the collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi and saw their fatal flaw. They were monolithic. One bad loan to one powerful king had brought the whole thing down. So, Giovanni designed his bank differently. He created what was essentially the world's first holding company. The Medici Bank wasn't one bank. It was a network of partnerships, each operating as a semi-independent entity in the major commercial hubs of Europe: Venice, Rome, Geneva, London, Avignon. Each branch was managed by a local partner who shared in the profits. This gave them skin in the game. But Giovanni, back in Florence, was the senior partner in all of them. He controlled the capital, and through his secret ledger, he had a god's eye view of the entire network. This structure was a system of financial firewalls. If the London branch made a bad loan and failed, it wouldn't sink the bank in Rome. The loss was contained. It was a revolutionary way to manage risk, allowing the Medici to expand aggressively while their rivals were terrified of another catastrophic collapse. A perfectly balanced ledger to see everything, and a decentralized network to survive anything. With these two tools, Giovanni was ready to hunt the biggest, most valuable client in the world. The Catholic Church in the 15th century was the largest and wealthiest multinational corporation on the planet. It owned vast lands, collected tithes and fees from every corner of Christendom, and moved enormous sums of money across borders. It was also a complete administrative mess. The papacy was desperate for a banker who was reliable, discreet, and efficient. Giovanni de' Medici stepped forward. He offered the Pope a deal he couldn't refuse. Using the Medici's international branch network, a bishop in England could deposit his tax revenues at the Medici branch in London. The London manager would record the credit in his ledger and send a note to Florence. The central ledger in Florence would be updated, and the funds would instantly be made available to the Pope through the Medici branch in Rome. It was fast, it was secure, and it was incredibly profitable for the Medici, who took a percentage of every transaction. They soon became known as God's bankers. But this was never just about managing money. It was about gaining leverage. By controlling the Pope's finances, the Medici controlled the Pope. When a rival banking family, the Spini, fell out of favor, the Medici were there to take over the PayPal accounts. When a pirate-turned-cardinal named Baldassare Cosa needed money to bribe his way into the papacy, the Medici bankrolled his campaign. When he became Pope John XXIII, he rewarded them with a near-total monopoly on the Vatican's finances. They now controlled the purse strings of the most powerful institution in Europe. They could use the Pope's authority as their own personal weapon. A merchant who was slow to repay a loan might find himself threatened with excommunication. They secured a monopoly on the trade of alum, a mineral vital for the textile industry, by convincing the Pope to declare that any Christian who bought alum from the Turks would be condemned. This was the Medici formula in action. Use a superior financial system to become indispensable to power. Then, convert that financial leverage into political power. And then, use that political power to generate even more profit. When Giovanni died in 1429, he passed this perfect financial machine to his son, Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo was even more ambitious than his father. He took the family's wealth and used it to become the secret master of Florence. Cosimo rarely held public office. He didn't need to. He ruled from behind the scenes, from his desk in the Medici palace. He controlled Florence by controlling its debt. He would grant friendly loans to the city's government and to its most influential families. His ledger wasn't just a record of accounts, it was a map of loyalties and obligations. If a rival family opposed him, he could call in their debts and ruin them. If a political decision needed to be made, he ensured the right people were in power by funding their campaigns. He was a puppet master, pulling the financial strings that made the city dance. And this is when the second part of the Medici strategy came into play. Cosimo knew that raw power created enemies. So, he began to spend his vast fortune on art, architecture, and philosophy. He funded the construction of the Great Dome on Florence's cathedral. He patronized artists like Donatello and Fra Angelico. He founded the Platonic Academy. This wasn't just generosity, it was a calculated investment in propaganda. Every beautiful painting, every magnificent building was a testament to Medici power and sophistication. It transformed them from ruthless bankers into enlightened patrons of civilization. It was a way of turning their money, acquired through cold, hard finance, into a legacy of cultural glory that would last for centuries. It was the greatest public relations campaign in history, and it ensured that we would remember the art and forget about the ledger that paid for it all. The Medici Bank eventually declined. Later generations lacked the discipline and genius of Giovanni and Cosimo. They made bad loans, got entangled in politics, and the great financial machine slowly ground to a halt. But the system they created never died. It took over the world. Double-entry bookkeeping is now the universal language of business. Every corporation on earth, from Apple to Amazon, runs on the principles perfected in that Medici ledger. The holding company structure, with its firewalls against risk, is the model for every modern multinational corporation. And the system of international branch banking they pioneered is the very foundation of our interconnected global economy. The Medici didn't just get rich, they wrote the operating system for modern capitalism. Today, new dynasties operate on the same principles. Investment banks like Goldman Sachs and private equity firms like BlackRock use financial leverage to influence governments and shape policy, just as the Medici did with the papacy. Billionaires use philanthropy to launder their reputations, plastering their names on museums and universities to distract from the often brutal ways their fortunes were made. The lesson of the Medici is chilling and timeless. The world is not run by the people you see on television. It's not run by presidents or prime ministers. It is run by the people who control the flow of money. The people who understand the secrets of the ledger. The Medici proved that with a superior financial system, a small family of merchants could become more powerful than kings. They turned information into wealth, wealth into political power, and political power into a permanent legacy. They forged the modern world from the pages of a secret ledger, and we are all still living in it. History has shown this pattern again and again. The real power is never the one in the spotlight. It's the one behind the curtain, counting the coins and balancing the books. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.